Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Marco, just an Italian-American guy who can't get enough of Europe's dark side. You know, the stories that don't make it into the travel guides. The ones locals still whisper about over wine in old cafes. Tonight's story comes from Belgium, specifically from the Flemish countryside just outside Ghent. Beautiful region, right? Medieval architecture, cobblestone streets, those gorgeous canals. But like everywhere in Europe, beneath that postcard-perfect surface lies something older, something that remembers. This is a true story shared with me by a man I'll call Thomas. He's from Antwerp, and what happened to his family in an old farmhouse they inherited still haunts him to this day. It's the kind of encounter that makes you realize those old superstitions your grandmother talked about, they exist for a reason. Before we dive in, let me give you some context. In Belgian folklore, particularly in the Flemish regions, there's a deep belief that certain houses hold on to their history. These old farmsteads, some dating back to the 1600s, they've seen centuries of lives pass through their doors. Births, deaths, secrets, tragedies. The walls absorb it all. And when something terrible happens in these places, when someone dies with unfinished business or deep resentment, that's when things get truly unsettling. Because in Belgian tradition, a restless spirit doesn't just wander. It anchors itself to a specific place, usually the room where it met its end. So let's turn down the lights and get comfortable. This one's going to stay with you. Thomas came from a working-class family in Antwerp. His father had worked at the docks his entire life. His mother cleaned offices in the city center. Money was always tight. They lived in a small apartment near the port, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors' conversations through the thin walls. But Thomas had done well for himself. He'd studied engineering, got a good job with a pharmaceutical company, married a wonderful woman named Sophie. Together, they'd built a comfortable life. Not wealthy, but stable enough to afford small luxuries their parents never could. When Thomas's great-uncle Edouard passed away at the age of 92, the family was surprised to learn he'd left Thomas his property. A farmhouse in the countryside near a village called Sint Maartens-Latem, about 20 kilometers from Ghent. Thomas had only met his great-uncle a handful of times. Edouard had been a recluse, living alone in that farmhouse for as long as anyone could remember. He rarely came to family gatherings, and when he did, he was quiet, withdrawn, always seeming uncomfortable in crowds. The lawyer handling the estate was clear. Edouard had specifically requested that Thomas inherit the property. No one else. The old man had even left a letter, sealed and addressed to Thomas personally. Thomas opened it that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with Sophie looking over his shoulder. The handwriting was shaky. The words in Dutch were formal, old-fashioned. "Thomas," it began, "I leave you this house because you are young and practical. You will do what needs to be done. But I must warn you. There is a room in the attic that has been sealed since 1953. Do not open it. Do not disturb it. Some doors are meant to stay closed. If you cannot live with this condition, sell the property immediately. Do not, under any circumstances, break that seal. Your uncle, Edward?" Thomas and Sophie exchanged confused looks. A sealed room? What kind of condition was that? "It's probably just some old superstition," Sophie said, always the practical one. "Maybe there was water damage or structural issues he never fixed." Thomas wanted to believe that. The inheritance was a blessing. They'd been saving for years to buy a house, and property in that area wasn't cheap. If they fixed it up, they could either sell it for a good profit or use it as a weekend retreat. They decided to visit the property the following Saturday. The drive from Antwerp took about an hour, through flat Flemish countryside dotted with farms and small villages. As they approached Sint Maartens-Latem, the landscape became more rural, more isolated. The farmhouse stood at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by fields on 3 sides and a small forest on the 4th. It was typical Flemish architecture, red brick with a steep tiled roof, white trimmed windows, and a barn attached to one side. The key was waiting for them at the local notary's office in the village. The notary, an elderly man named Meneer Janssens, handed it over with a strange expression. "You're Edward's nephew?" he asked. "Great-nephew," Thomas corrected. Meneer Janssens nodded slowly. "Your uncle was a good man. Quiet, kept to himself, but he had his reasons." He paused. "Did he leave you any instructions about the house?" "Just some advice about maintenance," Thomas lied, not wanting to get into the strange letter. The notary looked like he wanted to say more, but simply wished them well and sent them on their way. When they unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the house felt heavy. Not dirty or neglected. Actually, it was surprisingly clean. But there was a weight to the air, like walking into a church or a library. That particular silence that feels thick, substantial. The ground floor was modest. A kitchen with old appliances, a sitting room with worn furniture, a small bathroom. Everything was dated but functional. Photographs lined the walls, mostly of Edward as a younger man. Some of relatives Thomas vaguely recognized. The stairs to the second floor creaked under their weight. Up here were 2 bedrooms and another small bathroom. Both bedrooms were simple, neat, the beds made with military precision. And then there was the narrow door at the end of the hallway, the one that led to the attic. Thomas tried the handle, locked. But more than that, the door frame had been sealed with some kind of industrial adhesive, the gaps filled and painted over. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure this door stayed closed. "This must be the room he mentioned," Thomas said, running his fingers along the sealed edges. Sophie peered at it closely. "This isn't just a lock, Thomas. Someone really didn't want this opened. Maybe we should respect his wishes." But Thomas was already thinking practically. "If we're going to sell this place, we need to know what's behind here. Could be structural damage, mold, anything. We can't sell a property with a mystery room." Over the next few weeks, they began fixing up the farmhouse. New paint, repairs to the plumbing, updating the kitchen. They decided to sell it. The commute from Antwerp would be too much for daily living. But as a weekend house, it was perfect. They started staying overnight on weekends, getting a feel for the place, making plans. And that's when they began to notice things. The first incident happened on a Friday night. They'd been painting the sitting room and decided to stay over rather than drive back to Antwerp late. Thomas was exhausted and fell asleep quickly. He woke around 2 a.m. to a sound. At first, he thought it was Sophie moving around, but she was asleep beside him. The sound came again, a creaking from above, from the attic. Old houses make noise, Thomas told himself. Wood settling, temperature changes. He rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. But then he heard something else. A voice. Faint, muffled, like someone calling out from very far away. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, desperate. Thomas sat up, heart racing. The voice came again, definitely from above, definitely from the sealed attic room. "Sophie," he whispered, shaking his wife awake. "Do you hear that?" She listened, still drowsy. "Hear what?" The voice had stopped. They sat in silence for several minutes, but nothing. Eventually, Sophie convinced him it had been a dream, that he'd been working too hard. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always around 2 a.m., always the same muffled, desperate calling. Thomas started losing sleep. Dark circles formed under his eyes. Sophie heard it too on the 3rd night, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. "Maybe it's someone playing a prank," she suggested, "or sound carrying strangely from the neighbors." But the nearest neighbor was half a kilometer away, and the voice was too close, too immediate to be coming from outside. Thomas went to the village, to the cafe where locals gathered, and carefully asked about the farmhouse. An old woman, Mevrouw de Vries, stopped mid-conversation when she heard the address. "That's Edward van der Berg's place," she said quietly. "Your family?" Thomas nodded. "I inherited it." "Did you know my uncle?" Everyone knew Edward. Good man. Troubled, but good. She paused. "Did he tell you about the attic?" Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "He mentioned it should stay sealed." Mevrouw de Vries looked around, making sure no one else was listening too closely. "There's a reason for that. Something happened in that house long before Edward owned it. Back in the war." "Which war?" "The second one. The house belonged to a collaborator then, a man named Hendrik Vermeulen. He was Flemish, but worked with Germans, helped them find resistance members, Jews in hiding. Made a lot of money from it, too." She took a sip of her coffee. "In 1944, just before the liberation, the resistance caught him. They took him to his own attic, interrogated him there. He confessed to everything, named names, begged for his life. But they hanged him anyway. Right there in that attic room." Thomas felt sick. "And my uncle knew about this?" "Edward bought the house in 1950. It was cheap. No one wanted it because of the history. He was young, needed a place to live, didn't believe in ghosts. But within weeks, he started hearing things. Voices from the attic, pleading, bargaining. It drove him half mad. So he sealed it. In 1953, he brought in a priest, had the room blessed, then sealed it himself. Filled the gaps with concrete, painted it shut. The voices stopped after that, at least mostly. But Edward never went up there again, never opened that seal." Thomas drove back to the farmhouse in a daze. He found Sophie in the kitchen and told her everything. "We're opening it," he said firmly. "We need to know what's in there. Maybe there's just rot or water damage, and the sounds are just our imagination working overtime." Sophie wasn't convinced, but she didn't argue. That afternoon, Thomas got his tools and began working on the sealed door. The industrial adhesive was tough, but after an hour of careful work with a utility knife and a crowbar, he managed to break the seal. The lock on the door itself was old, rusty. It took some force, but it finally gave way, with a loud crack. The door swung open, and a wave of cold air rushed out. Not just cold, but bitter. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. Thomas stepped into the attic. It was dark, the single window having been boarded up from the inside. He switched on his flashlight. The room was empty except for a single wooden beam running across the ceiling. And hanging from that beam was a rope. Old, frayed, but unmistakably a noose. The room was otherwise bare, just dust and old floorboards. But there was something wrong about the space, something that made Thomas's skin crawl. The air felt thick, resistant, like walking through water. Sophie stood in the doorway, refusing to enter. "Thomas, let's just close it back up. Please." But Thomas was already examining the room, looking for any sign of structural damage that might explain the sounds. There was nothing. The roof was sound, the walls solid. As he turned to leave, his flashlight caught something scratched into the wooden floor near where the noose hung. Words carved deep into the wood in Dutch. "Ik hield alleen van mijn gezin." I only loved my family. That night, the voices were louder. No longer muffled, no longer faint. Clear, anguished, speaking in rapid Flemish, words Thomas could now understand. "Please, I had no choice. They would have killed my wife, my children. Please, you have to understand. I only wanted to protect them." The voice repeated these phrases over and over, a broken record of justification and pleading. Thomas and Sophie sat in their bedroom, lights on, clutching each other. "We're leaving," Sophie said. "First thing in the morning, we're leaving and never coming back." But when they tried to leave at dawn, they found every door and window in the house locked from the inside. Not just locked, but sealed somehow, refusing to budge no matter how hard they pulled. Thomas called the police, but his phone had no signal. Neither did Sophie's. It was as if the house had cut itself off from the outside world. The voice from the attic grew more insistent, more desperate. It began calling Thomas by name. "Thomas, you must understand. Thomas, please listen. I was not a bad man. I was protecting my family. Thomas, please." For 3 days, they were trapped. They ate what little food was in the kitchen, drank water from the taps, and tried every possible way to escape. Breaking windows, trying to force doors, nothing worked. The voice never stopped. It filled the house, seeping through the walls, following them from room to room. And slowly, Thomas began to understand something. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a confession, an eternal one. Hendrik Vermeulen, the collaborator, the man who'd betrayed his neighbors to the Nazis, had been trapped in his final moments of justification. His last words, his desperate attempt to explain himself, had imprinted on that room, on that house. And by opening the sealed door, Thomas had broken whatever spiritual barrier Edouard had created. He'd given that confession a voice again. On the 4th day, Thomas did something that surprised even himself. He went up to the attic, stood in the center of that cold room, and spoke directly to the presence. "I hear you," he said. "I understand what you're trying to say. But it doesn't matter. Your reasons don't change what you did. The people you betrayed, they had families too. They loved their children too. You made your choice, and you have to live with it. Or in your case, die with it." The voice stopped. The house fell silent. And in that silence, Thomas heard something else. Something that sounded like a sob. Deep and anguished, and finally, after 70 years, defeated. The locks clicked. The doors opened. Thomas and Sophie ran to their car and drove away without looking back. The house burned down 3 weeks later. The fire department said it started in the attic, but there was no electrical wiring up there, nothing that could have sparked a flame. The villagers weren't surprised. In fact, according to Mevrouw de Vries, they seemed relieved. She told Thomas something when he came to collect the insurance paperwork. "Your uncle spent 50 years keeping that voice quiet, keeping it contained. He knew if it ever got out again, if anyone ever heard the full confession, it would be the end. Some guilt is too heavy for this world to hold." Thomas never rebuilt. He sold the land for what he could get and tried to forget the whole thing. But sometimes, late at night when his apartment in Antwerp is quiet, he swears he can still hear it. That pleading voice, that desperate justification, forever trying to explain the inexplicable. Because that's the thing about Europe's dark history. It's not really history. It's still here, still present, waiting in sealed rooms and forgotten places, waiting for someone to open the wrong door and let it speak again. Thanks for listening to another dark tale from across the Atlantic. Until next time, stay curious, but maybe respect those sealed doors.